Welcome. I'm Kit Leggett, and I'm a member of the Social Sciences Subcommittee, and we bring these various classes to you. And our professor today is Dr. Fred Johnson, and he's one of our favorites. You're all, yes.
Likewise, yes.
Yeah. We're welcoming everybody who's in the classroom and also to people who are out in the virtual classroom. And we say special thanks today to Gloria Goodwin and Joan Carney and Frank Carney for supporting our hybrid modality. Thank you for all of those modalities, excuse me. And if you have questions or comments to pose at the appropriate times, but I think we're probably going to ask them to wait to the end of the presentation today, but make sure that you do ask for a microphone before you ask your question. And online participants may share any questions that you may have in the Zoom chat, and our technicians will relay them on your behalf. As you know, our director, Ian McNeil, will be leaving HASP at the end of this month. And our very own Amy Weber will be assuming the director's role. And so you are invited to a staff open house next Wednesday, that's March 13, from 2:30 to 4 p.m. in the HASP office. We're going to celebrate Ian and Amy as we near the end of this, this transition. And we will be providing cake and coffee to you. So that'll be fun, sad and fun. Well, last week we explored how the fall of the Berlin Wall reverberated throughout the world and how it has shaped history, especially European history. But I think most of us were all around somewhere when this occurred. Maybe you can remember where you were when the Berlin Wall fell, and you remember what a pivotal event in history it was. So that was last week. And this week, our discussion with Dr. Johnson is going to focus on the reunification of the formerly Soviet-occupied East Germany with West Germany on October 3rd, 1990. And Fred Johnson is a professor at Hope. He's been there since 2000. And he has many degrees, 2 of which are from Kent State University, MA and a PhD. And before he was involved in higher education, he was in the United States Marine Corps, Semper Fi. And his primary field of study is 19th century US history, specifically the Civil War. Are you still teaching that to the inmates up in Muskegon?
Yes.
You are.
And the fall of this year will be modern European history as well.
Very good. Thank you. Other areas of expertise for Fred are 20th century US history, US military history, and African history. And so I think it's time now to get ready to welcome our favorite presenter, Dr. Fred Johnson.
Thank you. I don't know what happened. Sure. Do you all remember first of all, good morning. It's good to see your faces. I mean, really good to see your faces. You remember those old Lon Chaney werewolf movies or the Frankenstein movies where the people will come out, the villagers with the torches and the pikes and stuff, you know, get the monster? That's been my life ever since I handed back midterms. So it's really good to see your faces. Let's continue on with our study. We looked at the global implications of the Berlin Wall pretty much before we got to the wall last week. We're going to go a little bit beyond unification, but to pick up just a quick recap, I thought it would be appropriate to go back to 1945 because it suddenly struck me in revising this that You know, from 1945 to 1950, those were some busy, 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 busy years. It wasn't just enough to end World War II. That was busy enough. A European theater and a Pacific theater. And oftentimes when we talk about the Pacific theater of war, we tend to emphasize the European theater of war because it was, well, Europe. And you think, you know, Pacific theater, islands, Guadalcanal, the Solomons, the Marianas, the Gilberts, the Caroline Islands, they're just islands. When you consider the total square mileage, the Pacific was much, much larger and therefore much, much more difficult to deal with because landing on an island through an amphibious operation is much more difficult than traversing, well, landlocked areas. So in 1945, we finally get rid of the two monsters on the left, Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. And then, of course, there's the one on the right, Hideki Tojo, the former leader of the imperial government, the military government in Japan. At the end of World War II, we went over the fact that Germany was divided between the Russians, the French, the Americans, and the British. But before we get too deep into what becomes the Cold War, we must address some first things first. And one of those was part of what made 1945 to 1950 so busy was that in addition to everything about Berlin and the beginning of a Cold War, as the dust is settling and the smoke is clearing, there were still the revelations that people were trying to wrap their minds around. I don't think that we take time enough to figure out what it must have been like for that generation of people. I've read accounts that said that the average World War II soldier, airman, Marine in World War II came from towns like Borculo, Zeeland, Holland. There's nothing preparing them in their growing up in their lives to prepare them for what they're about to see in Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, Mauthausen, Chelmno, Ravensbrück. Nothing prepares them for that, for the horror they're about to see for not just murder, but industrial murder on an industrial scale. So just as humanity took a shock to its collective nervous system with regard to World War I, they finally figured out in that war that it was that bad in that moment. They knew that. Somehow humanity, that same humanity, they took that collective nervous shock from 1914 to 1918. Then they got to deal with the Great Depression. Then they got to deal with the rise of dictators. Then they got to deal with this too. And then before the ink is dry on the surrender document, they're coming into a reality where there's a Cold War. How do you wrap your mind around this part right here? Those American soldiers that they're the first ones to see human beings who are walking around that are more dead than alive. And not dead and alive because of the pressures of warfare, but because somebody meant for it to be that way. Now, we asked last week, why didn't we bomb some of these places like Auschwitz? And part of the reason is because, as I mentioned to you last week, that American bombers didn't have the range, or they don't have smart weapons. They were dumb weapons, so you would have ended up killing the people you're trying to save. But there's a little bit more information. Ron, you want to go ahead and share what you tell them what you shared with me at the end? Yeah, where's the mic? Something about fighter escorts for the bombers. Thank you.
So the question is a valid one, but in the end, when the decision was made to bomb Germany, there were only two countries that could bomb Germany. It was Britain and the U.S., and they all had to work out of Britain, which meant they had to build facilities over there to accommodate the 17s, the 24s, and the additional bombers the British were going to furnish and all that. Once that was done, then they could commence flying missions into Germany. Now, that said, they knew they would meet anti-aircraft guns and whatever, but they figured, sadly, that the 11 machine guns on the 24s and the 17s would be enough to fend off and defend themselves. So on the initial phases of bombing, I don't know how many of you are familiar with bomber formations and attack, but they fly at different levels so they don't shoot each other.
Mm-hmm.
The short straw is the lower levels.
Right.
In the early part, the 100th Air Wing flew the lower level, they drew the short straw. They had 13 planes. One came back and crash landed miles short of the runway where they was home. So they decided to pitch in fighter escorts. Well, the fighters available were the British Supermarine Spitfires, and the one we had the most of was the Republic P-47. Now, if you look here, I'm not going to go into too many details here, but the P-47 was a tank. It was made to take hits. The thing that both planes lacked was range. So when the bombers took off, by the time they hit the German border, and you can see that's not very far, all the fighters had to turn around and go back, and the bombers were on their own again. Now,
So that's essentially, by the time they cross the channel, they're on their own.
Yeah.
By the time they cross the channel, they're on their own. So I think what Ron's getting to is that you're not going to find a fighter plane until the P-51, 1943, 1944, that can actually make the journey from England all the way to target inside of occupied Germany and then back. When they had that fighter escorts, then the numbers of bombers went down, right? They're shut down.
that's correct, because up until the P-51, the meantime life of a bomber, unfortunately, and the crew was 11 missions. That was it. We could make the planes, but we could not train crews.
And that was the key point. It's a lot faster to build a plane than it is to train an air crew. You know, it takes 20 years to raise a human being, right? You make a plane in a lot shorter time.
So
Okay.
the last point I'll
Yes.
quickly make it is the game is to get to the industrial heart of Germany to cripple the war machine, their industry. Bombing the camps would have done something, but it wouldn't have shortened the war.
Right.
And you can start putting two and two together there. But yeah,
As I mentioned to you all last week, if you have not seen that shit, I think it's on Apple TV, Masters of the Air. Critics have said that it is about the closest you're going to get to reality of the air war in Europe during World War II. Masters of the Air. It's about one air group during World War II. Thanks, Ron. So 1946, because of what happens here, and again, you have to look at these, look at this map. Don't forget that at the beginning of World War II, because of the 1939 Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, when the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe go across the Polish frontier on September 1st, 1939, the agreement between Stalin and Hitler was Hitler would take the western half of Poland, Stalin would take the eastern half, so Poland ceased to exist by September 3rd. Poland has gone through this several times throughout its history. It's been like, that's why they have something called the Polish Corridor, an invasion route to the rest of Central Europe. So Poland literally ceases to exist. And for the Americans and the British, the mere fact that Stalin agreed to this should have told them what kind of ally they were going to get. But at the same time, that's the price that the Americans and the British paid for isolating Russia during the interwar years from 1919 to 1939. No friends in the neighborhood, so they made friends with the people that they could find. So in 1946, the system, and I want to emphasize the system of death camps, resulting from a conference at Wannsee in early 1942, where Reinhard Heydrich, who Adolf Hitler said called him the man with the iron heart. Do you know how much of a monster you have to be for Adolf Hitler to call you a person with an iron heart? Reinhard Heydrich and his henchmen sat down at a conference center just outside of Munich, and they had took several days with cigarette breaks, lunch breaks, nice walks through the garden to very calmly discuss how they're going to eliminate European Jews, logistically, militarily. They're not going to shoot them anymore because they need the bullets for the Russians. And why would you waste a bullet on a Jew anyway? They were putting them around in the back of gas trucks and redirecting the exhaust into the truck, but they need the gasoline for the Russian front. So the gas chambers was found to be a more economical, efficient, faster method of doing the job. Again, I don't know, and I don't want to know how people can be like that to reach those kind of conclusions. But in 1946, when the world finds out, there is a thing called the war crimes trial that had to be had. Now, we heard this brief clip from Winston Churchill last week, predicting an iron curtain being drawn across Europe.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. And all are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. There never was a war in history easier to prevent by timely action than the one which had just desolated such great areas of the globe.
If there's one thing that American policymakers and presidents especially know coming out of World War II, it's that. They just lived through the rise of the dictators. They just fought a 4-year war in the Pacific and the European theater. And then given the exigencies of American domestic politics in the post-war period, people like Joe McCarthy, not one American president is in a position to forget what happened to bring World War II on. It generally is understood that in 1919, we did not join the League of Nations because there were people in the Senate who said, we don't want to be obligated to get involved in a war that doesn't necessarily threaten the American nation physically. That makes sense. Senate has Article 2 powers for advising consent. They advised don't do it, so we didn't. And then the bloodless victories came. The Japanese aggression in China in 1937, the rape of Nanking, as Iris Chang would put it, the abuse of Asians, not Japanese. And then while Winston Churchill is talking about an Iron Curtain being drawn across Europe, at the very time that he's doing that, I'm trying to get us to understand that while Churchill is talking about an Iron Curtain being drawn across Europe, in the same moment, which goes to emphasize that this is a very busy period, the war crimes tribunals are going on in Nuremberg, in Europe, for the monsters that caused the Holocaust. So, sitting in the witness dock, you see in that first row, from the very top, Hermann Goering, chief of the Luftwaffe, all right? Toward the end of the war, the number 2 man in the Nazi regime. Then Hess. Then I think the guy in the military uniform is Jodl. Their time for justice could not come soon enough. While that's going on, in the meantime, in 1946, we mentioned that Stalin was giving a speech where it became very clearly apparent, at least to one American diplomat, George Frost Kennan, that the Russians were not going to be the kind of partners that they had been during the war. They were taking a decidedly hostile tone. So he advised containment, which became pretty much the through line for American foreign policy, no matter where it was, no matter what continent, throughout the entire Cold War. By 1947, the Russians were getting more hostile, but the British, concerned about hanging on to whatever empire they had, were facing a crisis in Greece. The British were not going to be able to hang on to the empire they had because after 2 world wars, first of all, to be a colonizer takes money and military power. After 2 world wars, losing 2 generations within a 20-year period, they don't have that anymore. After all, it is an island nation with limited resources to include human resources. But there was a communist insurgency in Greece. The British were trying to hold on to it, and they just simply couldn't. They tried, but they just didn't have, they simply were exhausted. So they had to leave. And in the wake of that, Harry Truman, the American president, who has seen those dictators, is not going to be guilty of watching something else happen and not responding to it fast enough, like Winston Churchill warned. Don't forget, he said, that whole conflict, World War II, the European conflict, 50 million people did not have to die. 50 million. That's just the European count. Did not have to die. It was the weakness and failure, yes, the failure of Western democracies to stand up to international bullies that eventually produced that outcome. The president's not going to let that happen. So he articulates something that became known as the Truman Doctrine, where he said, we will provide political, military, and economic assistance to all democratic nations under threat from external or internal authoritarian threats. Well, that sounds really nice and fuzzy, but what does it mean? I mean, what is the the catalyzing point where you get involved in someone's internal affair. I mean, does that mean that we had to get involved in internal politics and not ours? People like to reach back and grab 1796, George Washington's warning about not getting involved in foreign entanglements. Is that what that is? Is this the new era now? There are only two real games in town, one being the Soviet Union. That's not viable. And then, well, the French and the British, they're losing colonies in Africa and Asia, and maybe necessarily so. So we enter into this period during the Cold War where Germany, being a former lethal enemy, very quickly, Cold War politics takes Germany and reshuffles things to now they're being reinterpreted, at least the Western part, as a trusted, necessary ally. So in 1947, the British and the Americans, they take their zone, they combine them, and they call it someplace called Bazonia. I do not know where they got that name from. It sounds more like something from a Warner Brothers cartoon, but they did that to combine their forces to offset the Soviets. And you'll notice that in the red zone, there is a multicolored little square there. That's Berlin, also subdivided to the American, British, and French sectors. Deep inside the Russian zone, not just in there, but deep inside the Russian zone, reachable only by land. In 1947, speaking of busy periods, George Marshall, the former chief of staff of the US Army, George Marshall becomes, or ascends to the level of being the American Secretary of State. And in 1947, the Congress approves legislation or funding for something called the ERA, the European Recovery Act. Because in 1947, the Europeans, just like Ron was pointing out, there's been a massive bombing campaign. The 8th Air Force have been bombing during the daytime, doing something called daylight precision bombardment. The British, having learned their lesson during the Blitz in 1940, and again, because they have limited resources, they were doing something called nighttime saturation bombing. The translation on that is, if you're an American, the British thought we were nuts trying to put a bomb on a specific target. The British said, if it's down there and it's German, that's the target. They were understandably enraged by the Battle of Britain. So as the war went on, and these fighter planes started being produced that could get with drop tanks that could actually go from the bombers to bases in England, to bases in Germany, then deeper and deeper and deeper inside of occupied Europe. Europe was bombed incredibly. So the first thing people had to do was to find someplace to live, something to eat, and someplace to take care of their children. When people are not doing that, when children don't know how to do anything but cry when they're disturbed and when they're hungry. That's what they do. That's why they're children. So the European Recovery Act, in addition to other things, besides being a humanitarian gesture, was a well thought out plan that if you can inject American money into Europe, those parts of Europe that not under Soviet domination, that will connect them to you economically and begin a process where their economies will be integrated into yours. You follow what I'm saying? As a bulwark against the spread of communism. Because people who are desperate and hungry and cold and trying to take care of their children, they may just lend an ear to the communist seduction. So the European Recovery Act was designed to do that, to provide education, housing, food, in other words, and then to integrate all of Europe into the North Atlantic community or economy. And the Russians, for all that one may say about them, they're not completely dim. They're not completely stupid. They understood what was going on. So in 1948, the Americans and their British allies introduced a new form of currency in West Germany called the Deutschmark. The Russians responded by introducing something called the Ostmark. So now it's competing marks. You can see that this thing is escalating. But then what about Berlin? Berlin is the through point for all this stuff. We mentioned last week that the tit for tat in Berlin and the Russians eventually in 1948 cutting off land access since it is deep inside of the Soviet sector of Germany. They cut it off. And General Lucius Clay, who was the person in charge for the most part for the Americans, on June 13, 1948, sent a message to his bosses. There's no practicability in maintaining our position in Berlin, and it must not be evaluated on that basis. In other words, we cannot base our actions on whether or not we can or cannot be as influential in Germany or Berlin as we can be. We must look for something else beyond that. We are convinced that our remaining in Berlin is essential to our prestige in Germany and in Europe. In other words, the American reputation is on the line. Now, for a lot of folks, they may not seem important, but you know, take NATO, for example. Article 5. If you're a signatory to that, for example, Sweden and Finland just recently joined, it means something to be able to know that if something happens to you, that Article 5, that attack upon one means an attack upon y'all, that all the people who are signatories will show up to do their duty. And if they don't, well, then you got to rethink your foreign policy, don't you? Especially one of the people not showing up is the United States. We're convinced that our remaining in Berlin is essential to our prestige in Germany and in Europe. Bottom line, will you keep your word? Will you do what you promised to do? Whether for good or bad, it's become a symbol of American intent. Our reputation hangs upon what we do in Berlin. That's how important the fulcrum point Berlin was that early in the Cold War. The Russians cut off access to Berlin through the land, so the Americans and the British, for just over a year, just under a year, resorted to something called the Berlin Airlift. The Americans called their Operation Vittles. The British called there something like Operation Humanitarian Resupply, or I say it is so typically American, call it Operation Vittles. Like, yeah, some guy from Kentucky thought that of it. Their routes from Hamburg, Hanover, into Berlin. And there are accounts where, listen, I read one account recently where the planes were landing within 45 seconds of each other. 45 seconds on a round-the-clock basis. They're carrying everything. So after a year, the Russians said, okay, this is not working. I'm sorry, I thought it might be fun to have a Russian bear from the Bronx. But in the same year, 1949, when the Russians are lifting the Berlin airlift, when they're lifting their blockade on Berlin, there are things happening in Asia as well. That's the same year that Mao kicks Chiang Kai-shek off the mainland to Taiwan. These two guys had never really gotten along together all that well anyway. And besides, it was actually Madame Chiang who was the brains of the operation. And then in 1949, not least because of the difficulties with Berlin, NATO was formed again as a check against the Russians. You notice that the darker blue areas include Canada, Greenland, eventually Norway, the British. All those areas are the early signatories of what becomes the North Atlantic Community, the Northern Hemisphere. We have recently added Finland and Sweden. Sweden, after the Viktor Orban in Hungary finally allowed it to happen, and the Turks were holding up Swedish membership for a while as well. So by May 1949, Moscow had lifted the blockade, but what the standoff over Berlin had done was that it solidified the division of Europe. Berlin would be the place where things either would work or not work in Europe overall. It forced or gave incentive and impetus for the Western Allies to establish NATO. The crisis solidified East-West demarcation. Let me put it to you like this. A friend of mine from high school, Santo, joined the army, and he said that he was in Czechoslovakia, and he said that when he was stationed in Germany, that oftentimes when they were doing tank maneuvers, sometimes the Soviet tanks will come right up to the border and then turn around at the last minute. This constant, cat and mouse going on the entire Cold War. So, a lot of stuff that happened during the Cold War, the near misses, some of you are familiar with the book Failsafe and the film Failsafe, near misses like that happened for 45 years. And the blessing is we mostly didn't know about it. So Santos said he saw that all the time, that their tanks would go to the border, then they turn around at the last minute. I mean, just missing through World War III by that much. They also ended up like this, that Berlin was one of the few places on earth where US and Soviet armed forces stood face to face. That is, it was very important. It was absolutely essential geostrategically, tactically, and it was the one place where they simply could not fight. If Berlin turned on the flames, World War III was on. By the time you get to 1950, Cold War Europe looks like this. And it's not looking, well, too great, but things are stabilized. And plus, in the 1950s, as if things couldn't get more complicated or, more, I guess what, threatening for the West. Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin For a brief period of time, there was a Sino-Soviet alliance in the early 1950s. But you know, the two murderers could not figure out what the best way to murder people was, so that broke apart. The map of this period, this is into the 1970s, is daunting. You look at that, all of Eastern Europe. Russia extends for at least 10 time zones, all the way into East Asia, the Korean Peninsula. China is involved, that one area to the north of China, Mongolia. North Korea is in the black. And then even in Africa, the Horn of Africa, you have pro-Chinese Somalia, Ethiopia, and yet North and South. At one time, the nation of Yemen was divided between North and South, just like North and South Korea, North and South Vietnam was North and South Yemen. But with the fall of the Cold War, the ending of the Cold War, that country unified. We thought there would be some progress there, but they've been fighting each other ever since. What to do about Berlin? Well, the answer what to do about Berlin is nothing. Because at the start of the 1960s, there's two new leaders, one on the right, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, and the former PT boat commander, John F. Kennedy. Well, Khrushchev is obviously, as you can see, older than Kennedy, and thinks that his younger counterpart is not as well experienced, and therefore not as crafty, therefore not as intelligent. He's wrong. But Khrushchev is an old-style European diplomat, crafty guy, prone to making bombastic statements. And it was during his time that the Berlin Wall is built, Khrushchev's time. Bear with me as I read. During the early Cold War, West Berlin was a geographic loophole through which thousands of East Germans fled to the democratic West. So the communist East German authorities built a wall that encircled West Berlin. Don't get it twisted. The communist East German authorities did not do something without the permission or at least informing their Soviet masters in Moscow, okay? It was thrown up overnight, or relatively overnight, on 13 August 1961. That means during Kennedy's administration, the first year of his administration, that is, he's inaugurated in January. So about 7 months later, they're building this thing. For the next 3 decades, the city became the hot end of the Cold War as the nuclear superpowers glared across the wall. In some cases, literally. I'm told that there are tour groups that went to the Berlin Wall on the western side to look across into the east, as you will see in just a moment. So if this is the hot flashpoint, then what do you do then? How is it a Cold War? If this would be the hot war, where's the Cold War being fought? Well, that's why we did that global survey last week, because the Cold War had to be fought everywhere but here. The thing was built not very well, given the fact that it was built so quickly, but it was reinforced over time. Look, it doesn't mean that it wasn't formidable. It was. And I don't know if you ever dealt with concertina or barbed wire, but you know, row after row of barbed wire, concertina wire. It'll convince you that, yeah, you shouldn't go through there. See these people looking from the west to the east? So that's what slavery looks like. That's what oppression, that's what tyranny looks like. Yes, that's what it looks like. That is what they call the workers' paradise over there. That's what it looks like. And here's the amazing thing, or maybe it's not amazing. Because just like in the movie Amistad, when Anthony Hopkins playing John Quincy Adams is defending slaves who are trying to get their freedom, or in the film Braveheart, when Mel Gibson is playing the fictional character, but he gives that fantastic speech about freedom. The one common through line for every group of people on earth has always been this: when they're oppressed, they want freedom. It doesn't matter who they are or what the cause may be, they will fight. You know what? They'll die for freedom. That's how important it is to them. So yes, on August 17, 1962, Peter Fechter, who wanted freedom, was shot dead trying to do what? Cross a wall of bricks and machine gun towers and guard towers and machine guns and double concertina wire, all kind of checkpoints and so forth. Everything that said to him, you really shouldn't try to do this, but he tried anyway. And then there was this. East German soldier Hans Conrad Schumann, an East German soldier who did the unthinkable, well, the video was of him defecting. He literally ran up, just as you see in this picture right here. He ran to the wire, and he's not there with the things being built, right? He ran and jumped over the barbed wire and defected to the west. Now, needless to say, the East German authorities were not pleased with this. He eventually spent the next few decades in, that's too bad. And they built, in West Germany, they built this kind of statues memorial to him. So you might think that Schumann is a hero, and he was to many people in the West and in the East, except for this fact. When he defected to the West, leaving his family in the East. So therefore, East German authorities, Soviet authorities came down hard on his family. He lost contact with them. Over the years, he got depressed. He eventually ended up committing suicide because he just felt guilty about the kind of exposure he brought to them for his actions. The Berlin Wall came to symbolize everything that has to do with oppression, injustice, distrust. The Berlin Wall became a metaphor for the Cold War. And on June 26, 1963, the young American president, who Khrushchev was too prepared to dismiss, visited the wall. Now, I read accounts where Nikita Khrushchev was called the butcher of the Ukraine. You all know that the Russians killed millions of Ukrainians before World War II in the Holodomor. So Nikita Khrushchev had a rather, let's say, checkered resume to begin with. So to have him as an opponent during the Cold War was no small thing, but John F. Kennedy rose to the occasion. This is June 1963, just a few months before he's assassinated.
There are many people in the world who really don't understand, or say they don't, what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin. Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect. But we have never had to put a wall up to keep our people in, to prevent them from leaving us. All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the word, Ich bin ein Berliner.
That phrase is part of the Kennedy lore, just like Reagan's phrase that you're hearing in just a few moments. In 1964, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. took time out from the civil rights movement. Now, let me put this in context for you. This is 1964. This is going to be the same year that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 signed by Lyndon Johnson. He's invited by the mayor of Berlin, Willy Brandt, to come and visit the wall, because somehow the symbology is similar. That what King is fighting in the South, separate societies, oppression, injustice, is all buried in the wall as well. The wall symbolizes everything going on in the South is symbolized by the wall. Ideologically, but similar enough that one people's fight for freedom and the impact of their oppression is actually not that much different than another one, a continent and an ocean away. So he's visiting the wall. And you see this here, a mass escape of 57 people in October 1964 from East Berlin through a tunnel to the cellar of a former bakery in Bernauer Street, West Berlin. Tunneling. Were people serious? Sure looks like it about getting out of there. So yeah, in the East, it's bleak. People are desperate. They're arrested by the Stasi. They keep trying again and again and again. And look, it's not like they don't know what the consequences. It's not like they don't know that they try. They're going to be sent to a very terrible imprisonment. They know this and they try anyway. Checkpoint Charlie became the through point to East Berlin. So the nature of the Cold War, because of the Berlin Wall, was there were many fronts to the Cold War. You could not fight in Germany for obvious reasons. A breach of the wall would be a flashpoint that would start World War III. And plus, you had two nuclear armed superpowers that can't afford to fight that third world war. Because this time, it's not going to be just 50 million people lost or an inconvenience for economies or whatnot. It's going to mean the end of the species. So they just can't do it. So the front shifts around the world globally, as per George Frost Kennan's advice. Like, for example, in the Caribbean, Americans are going to fight a Cold War there. In the case of Cuba, and then later on, you get into the 80s, even in Grenada, the residue from Castro's Cuba will go into the 1980s when President Reagan orders an operation to get rid of this guy in the middle, Maurice Bishop, the ones from left to right. The guy on the far left, Daniel Ortega, who was the leader of the Sandinistas. They tried to overthrow Nicaragua. Maurice Bishop, who got to be too friendly to Castro, standing to his immediate left. By the time you get to the 1980s, Ronald Reagan, every other American president is like, we're not having a second Cuba in the Caribbean that close to the United States. So yeah, they invaded. Operation Urgent Fury. So that threat was neutralized. Some of these things were not big threats, in hindsight, or even at the time. But again, everywhere but the Berlin Wall, they're symbolizing this, and that wall is symbolizing so much where you can't do anything there, so they're fighting it around the world. Another front, Central Asia. In 1979, when the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini came back to Iran, the other guy on the left, Saddam Hussein was a secular leader in a nation that, if there were Muslims, they were Sunni. In Iran, they're primarily Shiite Muslims. That's enough of a difference between them, hate each other's guts. What eventually happened in the late 1980s was the Iran-Iraq War, which many people called World War I in the Middle East. It was back and forth with young men, the Iranians throwing wave after wave after wave of young men into battle, the Iranians doing the same thing, just a bloodbath and a war of attrition that eventually ended up with both of them just stopping because they were both exhausted. Another front was in Mediterranean, Europe and Mediterranean Africa. In Germany, it was believed that Libyan terrorists had bombed an American nightclub, or a nightclub where American servicemen frequented that club very often. So in response, the person that was held responsible was Muammar al-Gaddafi. I told you all last week he came to power in 1967. He's just another one of many African strongmen that will rise through the military, overthrow the government, promise liberty, freedom, and love, but then proceed to rape their country, being a kleptocrat, and then put their neck on the back of people's heel on the back of people's necks. So on April 6, 1986, President Reagan authorized an airstrike that got close to Gaddafi. In fact, it got so close, you didn't hear from him for a while. They sent F-111 Aardvark. The Aardvark was the name they gave to this aircraft. I always thought you'd get to find aircraft, like the Lion or the Jaguar, but Aardvark, which is me. So they flew this Aardvark, and so the F-111 was one of that generation of aircraft that had the variable geometry sweep wing that allowed it to fly at really fast speeds. And so the goal was to take Gaddafi out. They missed, but it's called Operation El Dorado Canyon. President Reagan said the airstrikes on Monday night near Tripoli and Benghazi were a single engagement in a long battle against terrorism. The war was still the Cold War, but by 1986, there was a new thing developing that we did not come to appreciate at that moment yet. Don't recall that in 1983, 84, 83, embassies blown up, the US, the airport's blown up in Beirut. 234 Marines are killed by a truck bomb. For Americans, that's still kind of a new sort of activity. But it is the initial stages of a very long campaign that will culminate at the World Trade Center in New York City on September 11, 2001. Just the first of many strikes. I thought I would give you a personal view of how the Cold War is fought, the near misses throughout the Cold War. It happened in Norway. Now, many of you all know that Norway shares a border, a small border, but a border nonetheless with Germany. So doctrine during the Cold War was this. As I mentioned to you, my best friend Santos said that we were taught this as well, that if warfare broke out in Europe again, the Russians were going to come through two places. The first place would be Berlin, more than likely. So Germany would be the first flash point. The second flash point, they would come down from the north, across the border with Norway, come down Western Europe, seize Denmark, then go into Germany and do what? Seize Berlin. So either way, no matter where they came from, Berlin was going to be the target. So the Marine Corps, every year, or every other year, conducted operations called Operation Northern Wedding Beauregard to do what? Defend Norway in a war game. See, can we do it? Usually fought against the Americans, the Danes, the Dutch, and the British, fighting against the Germans. This particular war game, the USS Incheon, which was an American amphibious helicopter aircraft carrier, is used by the Marine Corps. The battle fleet spotted a Soviet Bear bomber. These things are long-range, nuclear-capable aircraft that can stay out for a long, long time. They have aerial refueling. They can be in the sky for hour after hour. I mean, these are big planes. They're dangerous planes. They're formidable planes, and they have long-range capability. Like I said, they're nuclear capable. So a Soviet Bear bomber was shadowing the fleet, not playing around, not just gathering intel, but shadowing the fleet. The order was given to go to general quarters. Now, if you've never been on a naval vessel, when order is given for it to go to general quarters, especially if it's like this, general quarters, this is not a drill. This means you are about to go to war. It's not practice. This is the real thing. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but you can't afford to assume anything other than your training says, this is the real thing, get ready for general quarters. It kind of sounds like this from the movie, The Final Countdown.
Sound general quarters.
Aye, Captain. Bosun.
Boatswain, aye, sir.
Sound general quarters.
Aye, sir.
General quarters. All hands, man your battle stations. Go up and forward on your starboard side, down and aft on your port side. General quarters. Time plus 2 minutes.
What the hell's going on? General quarters, sir. Come with me.
Time plus 3 minutes.
The Marines on board that aircraft, that helicopter aircraft carrier, when they sounded general quarters, what the Marines did was that they got ready for warfare. That is distributing weapons, including ammunition, live ammunition, putting on camouflage paint. Helicopters are on deck, spinning up the rotor blades just in case they get on and go wherever. And in the meantime, in a part of the Norwegian Sea, the North Sea that we could not see, there were F-14s being scrambled to go intercept this Bear bomber. So the F-14s are being sent to intercept this nuclear capable aircraft. At the time, the F-14 no longer in service. The last time, unless you saw Tom Cruise's latest Top Gun film, they used there, but it's being replaced by the F-18. But at the time, the F-14 was the absolute best aircraft in the Navy. So these F-14s are scrambled. They're about to intercept this bear bomber. And on the Incheon, these Marines are going down into the well of the helicopter carrier aircraft deck. Some people going up on deck to get into the helicopters. Other people going down into the well to get into amphibious assault vehicles to make the assault. It's going to be a combined aerial, heliborne, and traditional amphibious assault. Orders have been given. Weapons have been distributed. Gas grenades, regular grenades, smoke bombs, all the things, preparing for war. It is scary. It's really scary. And one Marine in particular was giving orders. This is where my master sergeant said, what do we do? I said, this is what we're training for. He said, what if we go to war? I said, this is what we're here for. This is what we're designed to do. We just waited for word to come back on what was going to happen. Fortunately, the F-14s intercepted the Bear bomber and crisis averted. Look, I don't want to oversell the point. I've never been in combat, okay? Let's get that straight. That's about as close as I've gotten. But if that was as close as it is, I don't need to know the real thing. It was terrifying. We were going to do our job because that's what we're there for. That's what Marines do, right? But we were going to do our job. But that's one of those many close calls during the Cold War, not in Berlin, but elsewhere where you couldn't fight in Berlin. By June 12, 1987, there were new leaders in the Soviet Union and the United States, Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Wilson Reagan. And on June 12, 1987, President Reagan, similar to John F. Kennedy, went to that wall and made it, and also an unforgettable speech.
And now the Soviets themselves may, in a limited way, be coming to understand the importance of freedom. We hear much from Moscow about a new policy of reform and openness. Some political prisoners have been released. Certain foreign news broadcasts are no longer being jammed. Some economic enterprises have been permitted to operate with greater freedom from state control. Are these the beginnings of profound changes in the Soviet state, or are they token gestures intended to raise false hopes in the West or to strengthen the Soviet system without changing it? We welcome change and openness, for we believe that freedom and security go together, that the advance of human liberty can only strengthen the cause of world peace. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
At the time, it just seemed like a bunch of rhetoric that maybe Gorbachev was listening, maybe he wasn't. He had his program of glasnost and perestroika, reform and openness, which many people like Vladimir Putin, it's important to remember that while this is going on, Vladimir Putin is a KGB officer in East Berlin. Okay, so the guy running Russia right now is a former KGB officer, not a former member of the Soviet state, but a former KGB as intelligence officer, the people that, enforce the terror of the regime. He's running the show right now. So any notions about somebody like that might back off, who's being nostalgic about the good old days when the Soviet Union was the Soviet Union. And there are people who are nostalgic about that. Well, and he knows just enough to push his agenda in Ukraine to include allegedly denazifying it. That goes deep into the Russian history and Russian psyche, but it's effective. Well, the idea that the wall might actually come down seemed just so remote, but then 2 years later, it was happening. People were taking sledgehammers to it. The East Germans just suddenly opened up all the borders, all the barriers, and people from the West and the East. I remember the news broadcast where Tom Brokaw was there that night and watching people going back and forth across the border. They were singing and dancing and happy and so forth. It was unbelievable. It meant that was okay. So Berlin is no longer a flashpoint anymore. After the Berlin Wall, and after everything about containment, which meant Korea and Vietnam and Castro and the battles for Angola in Africa, and also things that have been going on in Central America and South America as well. The whole thing with Iran-Contra, all those things, arms for hostages, the crisis in the Middle East, the Suez crisis of 1956, all that was part of the whole Cold War milieu, and Berlin symbolized that, and now it's just coming to an end. I kid you not, I've talked to people, not many of them, fortunately, that said things like this. I kind of miss the Cold War. What do you miss about it? What is it? What the terror? The threat of nuclear annihilation, which is still with us, by the way, but maybe not the same way it was. When our drill instructor told us in boot camp that in the event of a tactical nuclear attack, take your poncho, put it over you, just duck down low in the foxhole. I said to my foxhole mate, I think he's lying to us. We will not survive that. But on November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall was coming down, the Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill had forecasted, had warned against. And by the way, it's the 78th anniversary, on March 5th, yesterday, the 78th anniversary of Churchill's speech. What Churchill saying, we failed from 1933 to 1939. But from 1945 to 1989, we held the line. It was costly. In Korea, a bunch of veterans who are still not remembered properly for their sacrifice. Korea too often is called the forgotten war. In Vietnam, 58,000 names etched into a wall that maybe they should or should not have been there because of misjudgments by Robert McNamara and the people who the architects and engineers of that conflict. Either way, the Iron Curtain was being swept aside. It had come at a great cost of human life and effort. We cannot forget the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, where people literally voted with their feet, here from Eastern Europe to Western Europe. We can't forget 1968 Prague Spring, where Russian tanks rolled into Prague, again, because people were trying to do what? Throw out the Soviet yoke. We cannot forget the fact that Yugoslavia never did fully submit to Moscow. We can't forget what happened in other parts of Poland, where they tried to overthrow the Soviet yoke or people getting rid of that kind of oppression. We can't forget names like Alexander Solzhenitsyn or Andrei Sakharov. All these people to put everything on the line, not just for their freedom, but freedom, period. Carrying our water for us, well, they fought that consistent battle for freedom. Then, that's 1989. You fast forward to January 28, 1992. It's already a different planet. But apparently not different enough for the video to kick in fast enough. Well, this is what I use. Okay.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, distinguished members of Congress, honored guests and fellow citizens, thank you very much for that warm reception. You know, the big build-up this address has had, I want to make sure it'd be a big hit, but I couldn't convince Barbara to deliver it for me.
Sorry, you all. I just have to tell you one more time how wonderful it is to be talking to people who know who Barbara Bush was. You can imagine the frustration where I have people that asking me questions, who's Barbara Bush and will this be on the test? You don't get to ask both those questions in the same sentence.
See, the Speaker and the Vice President are laughing. They saw what I did in Japan, and they're just happy they're sitting behind me. I mean to speak tonight of big things, of big changes and the promises they hold, and of some big problems, and how together we can solve them and move our country forward as the undisputed leader of the age. And we gather tonight at a dramatic and deeply promising time in our history and in the history of man on earth. For in the past 12 months, the world has known changes of almost biblical proportions. And even now, months after the failed coup that doomed a failed system, I'm not sure we've absorbed the full impact, the full import of what happened. But communism died this year. And even as president with the most fascinating possible vantage point, there were times when I was so busy managing progress and helping to lead change that I didn't always show the joy that was in my heart. But the biggest thing that has happened in the world, in my life, in our lives, is this. By the grace of God, America won the Cold War. I mean to speak this evening of the changes that can take place in our country now that we can stop making the sacrifices we had to make when we had an avowed enemy that was a superpower. And now we can look homeward even more and move to set right what needs to be set right. Moods come and go.
And just like that, it was over. 4 to 5 years of being on constant alert, and just like that, well, maybe not just like that, but just like that, it was over. People were talking about the peace dividend. President Reagan had come into office talking about a 600-ship Navy. His intent was he knew that our economy was more nimble, more powerful, had a lot more depth, agility than the Soviet economy. It was a command economy. And his faith in the American economy, the American people, saw that playing the long game, we can simply outlast them to try to keep up with us when it comes to defending global areas. It simply was not sustainable for the Russians. The coup that President Bush is talking about was after Gorbachev exited office. For a brief time, Boris Yeltsin, who had a host of personal problems, was the president, and there was an attempted coup, and the attempted coup that failed and eventually put Yeltsin in charge, just went to show just how chaotic things were, how corrupt the Soviet system had been all along. But this is January 28, 1992. The peace dividend that President Bush is talking about was going to evaporate very quickly, because do not forget that in 1993, there will be an attempted bombing of the World Trade Center by a truck bomb in the basement of the World Trade Center. Again, we were at war, or should I say someone's at war with us, we just didn't know it. They couldn't take it out below ground, so 8 years later they took it out above with planes turned to flying bombs. We were already at war and did not know it. You can go to 9/11 and trace it back from 9/11 to 2000, the bombing of the USS Cole, to 1998, the bombing of the embassies in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi within moments of each other. Can we agree that if two embassies in two different countries get bombed within moments of each other, that's not accidental? There's a plan behind that. And then back to Beirut and other acts of terrorism that have been going on and on and on, back to 1993, and then again back to Beirut, the bombing of the embassy, the bombing of the airport. They were all signs that were missed somehow. We lost that battle. That was a new battle. But in any time, East Germany and West Germany were going to be uniting. And some of the problems were, how do you take the East German economy, which was nothing compared to what the West German economy was? Before coming to Hope College, I worked for a telecommunications company where we had a Voice of America. We were doing some site survey analyses for a Voice of America site in West Germany, just outside of Munich. They broadcast their stuff from Cuba. We broadcast our stuff to all the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, big antennas that I was responsible for doing the site survey analysis of. It was a mind-bending experience to be working with the German radio operator one day who said, he says, Johnson, come here. I know you're interested in this stuff. He took me over to a cabinet that stood about this high. And the cabinet had old tube technology from tubes for the radios that had been built in 1938 by Czechoslovakia. And on the radio tubes, they had the swastika of the Nazi regime. Now, this is the 1980s, okay? So I'm looking at a tube technology being used by an American radio station powered by Nazi engineering to broadcast stuff inside the Soviet Union. And I say, you know what? I told the German radio operator, I said, you know what? Someday I'm going to be teaching a class at Hope College. I'm going to tell my half scholars that they won't believe this. That just goes to show, though, how all these things merge together. And in West Germany, in Munich at that point, you could feel the Cold War was still going on. So the wall hadn't fallen yet, but you could feel the obvious differences between the West was vibrant, it was cosmopolitan, it was wealthy. The German road systems, the Autobahn, were sadly built by the Nazis, but they were fantastic. And in the West, the stories you hear about people coming from the East were that it was dour, it was gray, it was desperate. And of course, there was a secret police, the Stasi. And then, of course, the Russians. How to integrate the two economies, how to integrate the two peoples, one that's far behind culturally, economically, and then also, too, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, much resentment in the East. When people start coming from the East into the West, there's resentment economically. So it gives birth to, yes, here it comes again, far-right political movements in Germany. The last thing this planet can afford is a far-right political movement coming from, of all places, Germany. That simply doesn't end well for people at all, ever. So the thing to do for the Americans was for the Americans and the European Union, at that point, the EEC, the European Economic Community, was evolving into the European Union, how to integrate West Berlin and East Berlin as fast as possible, as seamlessly as possible, and not leave out the people who were there. How to cure the resentment. What do you do with the defense structure of NATO now that there's no longer an East Germany, but a Germany? What does that mean for Russia as an opposition force still on the other side of that divide between East and West, free and slave? How much of the defense burden share of NATO does Germany is it going to have to carry? All these questions had to be answered, but they were dealt with gladly, because after all, the Berlin Wall was down and the Cold War was over. By the time I get to whole college, I read a popular mechanics article in the early 2000s that said America had become a hyperpower. That is, we were the kind of power, Soviet Union is gone, Cold War is over, Berlin Wall is down. And so America was in that position in the early 2000s, 2000, 2001, where it was a hyperpower, according to popular mechanics. We are the kind of power on Earth where we can do anything we want. We have the airlift, sea lift, land lift capability to do anything we want. So when we do something cooperatively, it's because we want to, not because we have to. Well, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. But as some diplomats have said, if all you've got is a big hammer, then you have a very small toolbox. It's good to have a big hammer because sometimes hammers are needed. But part of that dynamic of being a hyperpower included within the equation a unified Germany. And because of what happened during Germany, not only from 1933 to 1990, remember that democracy ended for the whole country in 1933 when Hitler came to power in January. It will not come back. Certainly, misery and suffering in West Germany won't stop until 1945. But for the whole country, not until the fall of the Berlin Wall, which means effectively for East Germany, democracy leads in 1933 and does not return until 1990. That is a long time to be without freedom. So the wounds are deep. The reconciliation is still ongoing, and we'll see what happens with Germany in the future. Thanks very much. I always have to end with this guy.
We have two mics, don't we? And I will head to this end and Randall will take one from this side. Are you going to go down there? And we also might have something in the chat room, nothing from the chat room, but how about people in the classroom today?
To include your own experience, a few of you shared experiences that you had either behind the Iron Curtain or in East Germany or along the wall. So if you have any of those, please share.
Fred, in your opinion, are we simply fighting a new Cold War where the players have changed? Putin in Russia, Kim Jong-il, Kim Jong-un in North Korea. It seems like this is just a revision or revival of what many of us experienced in our youth. So I'm just curious.
I don't know if it's a new Cold War. It might be Cold War 2.0 or just maybe the second iteration of the original Cold War. Because you're right, Steve, that the original participants, Russia, China, North Korea, they're still there. We should be, in the case of North Korea, I was telling a student he's going to OCS this summer, and I was telling him, do you realize that North Korea's had only 3 leaders since the end of World War II? Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, and Kim Jong-un. That's over 70 years, and they've had only 3 leaders. It's the family business.
Yeah.
So, like anybody else, just like Bashar al-Assad in Syria, the son of Hafiz al-Assad, he's part of a minority community called the Alawites. They can't afford to not be in charge because the stuff they've done to people, if they're ever not in power, there's revenge to be taken. So they got to stay in charge. Same thing with Kim Jong-un and his family. Xi Jinping is carrying on as the autocrat in China. And as I mentioned before, Vladimir Putin is still hearing the echo of the Soviet Union. He remembers when. And he's acting like he intends to make it be that again. So there are echoes of the old Cold War, to be sure. But the one thing that is consistent is for all 3 of them, to include Maduro in Venezuela, the ones in the Eastern Hemisphere as well, and the wannabes on the African continent, there have been, I think, like 9 coups in the last 11 months in West Africa. You guys are kleptocrats, and usually when they overthrow a government, the new government always has these words in it: the People's Democratic something or other, blah, blah, blah. These people in Democratic is that somehow that'll make it all go to what they're really about, go away. The earth is still facing a lot of challenges. And so the echo of the Cold War in its new manifestation still requires that we adhere to that statement on the front of the National Archives, but I shared with you all before, I believe that when I was an undergrad at Bowie State, every time I took the subway downtown to do research at the National Archives, I always stopped and looked for a long time at the front of the National Archives on one of those colonnades. It said, the price of freedom, I'm paraphrasing, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. That is, there's not a day or a moment that you can afford to not be asleep, from people that are out there trying to take your freedom. They're always there. Sometimes it may be Russia, sometimes not, but they're there. It just so happens that since they are the same three people, they're consistent, so therefore we have to be as well. The only difference might be how we fight the new Cold War. But there are differences, obvious differences in that we have Vietnam as a partner now. The Philippines is a strong, remember the Philippines threw us out. The Philippines, Clark Air Force Base along Olongapo and Subic Bay a few years ago, they're inviting us back. In fact, they're not inviting us back, they're doing like this.
Last week, I talked about traveling in Moscow,
Yes.
being followed. What I didn't share was it's a long train ride to get from Italy to the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And when you cross through those Eastern European countries, they did not allow you to keep the currency. You had to turn in,
Right.
exchange the currency when you crossed the
Yeah.
border. Everything was that tightly controlled through all those Eastern European countries. And with our group, we didn't see anybody wearing any bright colors.
No.
One of the ladies in our group, a young blonde student, had a scarlet red coat on, and people were coming up to her thinking she was some kind of royalty because that was so uncommon.
You know what? During the Cold War, it's commonly known that inside the Soviet Union or other Eastern European countries, an article of clothing that was like gold American blue jeans.
Yes. Yeah.
And the reason why you check me out on this, remember, the reason why you had to turn in your Western currency, your dollars, is because of the thriving black market. It would undermine the national economy. You could be sent to jail for a long time if they caught you with American dollars in some of these East European countries, right?
Yeah.
So,
but not just dollars. Even from Poland into the Soviet Union, you had to turn it in. I mean,
right.
Even Eastern European currencies.
Yes.
We have one question. What is your opinion and how does this fit in on the war between Ukraine and Russia right now?
Well, okay, let me address it like this. From my viewpoint, the Ukrainians are carrying our water right now. I think that Volodymyr Zelensky is absolutely on point when he says, you know, we can either we're doing the fighting right here. The Ukrainians are uniquely motivated to fight the Russians because of the Holodomor during the 1930s when the Russians killed millions of Ukrainians, not because it was a bad harvest, it was an engineered famine by Stalin, man-made intentionally. Millions of Ukrainians died. They've lost Georgia and Russia. Or should I say, they lost Edward Shevardnadze, who was the Russian foreign minister, who was the foreign minister of the Soviet Union as the latter days. He went back to be the president of Georgia. They were invaded. They invaded Crimea, which is the city on the Black Sea, which is, you know, which gets you between East and West. So recall that when President Bush said, we're going to go fight them over there, so we need to fight them over here. Well, there may have been some problems with that in that context back then with going into Iraq, but the same principle applies. I don't know if we'll fight them over here, but it is the most aggressive land grab in Europe since the end of World War II. That should not escape our attention. And just like Winston Churchill said, it doesn't have to happen. And it should not be happening. And we have proven the Ukrainians all by themselves, not the Ukrainians, the Germans, the British, and the Americans, but just the Ukrainians have attrited Russian forces by close to 500,000 people. They clearly know how to fight, and they're willing to fight if they have the tools to do so. So we should support them sooner than later, with, of course, some oversight on where those dollars are going, because the Ukrainians, sadly, have had some challenges with corruption, but that those weapons can be got. They're fighting for their literal survival. And I do not pretend to believe that if Ukraine loses, that Poland, Romania, and other Eastern European nations, Moldova, even Belarus, are not at risk. There's a reason why the Swedes and the Finns have joined recently. They're there in that neighborhood. If they're worried, we should be worried, or at least concerned. Sweden has had a history of being neutral. They're not anymore. That means something. Those who have ears, let them hear.
So to follow that up, why is our Congress holding up those funds? Just to, put
Okay, why is the Congress holding up those funds? Because I'm not there. Just to put it bluntly.
In last night's news, we learned that in North Carolina, the Republican who won the nomination for governor of North Carolina denies the Holocaust.
That's the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's what we're up against, that kind of ignorance. What can we do?
Listen, you know what? You've heard, was it Mark Twain who said that a lie can run around the earth, 7 times before the truth gets its shoes on? Something like that. Now I'm paraphrasing. What can we do? Look, I don't know. Look, here's the thing. When I first got to Holland, right? I was invited, came down. Fred, people found out, you're a historian, do that, you deal with Africa. So at the time they were doing the Institute for Healing Racism. Can you come down to the chamber? They're having downstairs in the basement of the Chamber of Commerce, and can you help us out? I say, sure. What do you want me to do? We want you to give the history of race in 40 minutes. I say, I like to think I'm good, but I don't know if I'm that good. Well, I went over there anyway. So in dealing with this, there was a lawyer in the institute, which was trying to put this on the table and get the facts. The people that are doing this very sincere. If we just have the information, we can at least check off ignorance, which is not a problem, and take a step toward reconciliation, so on and so forth. So this guy in the room, he's a lawyer. So I started talking about the 1787 Constitution, the pro-slavery features of the Constitution. Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3, 3/5 compromise. Article 1, Section 9, the Migration and Importation Clause. Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3, the Fugitive Slave Compromise. 3 of them in the Constitution. Just about every book of integrity that talks about the Constitutional Convention will tell you that the convention almost collapsed several times because of debates over slavery. Southerners say either put it in there or we walk. Well, the founding fathers sadly did not go to the convention to end slavery. They went there to establish a government. So they were kind of pigeonholed and prepared to make compromises on slavery to appease the Southerners. So that's in there, not to mention the pro-slavery legislation passed later on in 1793, which was an update on Article 4, Section 2, Paragraph 3. So I'm going through all this stuff, and this lawyer, who's clearly, he's educated, he's smart, he can read, he can clearly pass tests. He says, well, Constitution's not pro-slavery. That's maybe not the whole thing, but the 1787 version was. He said, no, it's not. I said, you see it right up on the screen. That's not pro-slavery. I said, when you have people who are being referred to as three-fifths of all the persons, who do you think they're talking about? It's just not pro-slavery. I said, well, when they talk about the migration or importation of such persons, who gets imported? What human beings are being imported in 1787? He said, I don't care, it's not pro-slavery. You know what? So I stepped back. To get to your question, here's the answer. And at that moment, I said, what I'm dealing with here, this is not a question of intelligence. This man is clearly intelligent and educated and smart. He's made a decision to be stupid. In spite of the facts. That's what the whole psychology department is for. I'm an historian. So what can you do about that? My approach since then has been to follow the advice of the master. When people are going to do that, to kick the dust off my shoes and keep walking. Because you know what? There are people who simply not going to believe. It doesn't matter how many facts you throw at them, how many examples you give them, how many object lessons, they simply are going to be there. So they're going to always be there. And sadly, they've always been part of our electorate. At least 30% of our electorate from the early republic to now, they're there. So when we have somebody like that, so what that means for us, what it means for us, since there are people out there like that, and see, I've always told my students like this, you know, I would love to live in a world where the Ku Klux Klan doesn't exist, but they do. I think they're kooks. That's kind of the point. That's kind of beside the point. The thing is, they're kooky, but they believe their ideology, and then they take action upon it. That's the part that we had to be concerned with. Their beliefs may be a little bit askew and extreme, but they'll take action on them. That's where the rest of us have to deal with that, because they believe they'll do things like blow up the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. They'll do things like, I don't know, assaulting the U.S. Capitol and say it was just tourists with fourth graders that day. So because they do that, it is incumbent upon us to do more, which is to push back against it, keep having sessions like this, and vote. Vote. And I told my students in the American Revolution class, I don't care if you're far right, far left, or anything in between. What you must, I had 2 requirements in this class. 1, that you love democracy, and 2, that you love the Constitution. If you do those 2 things, we can dance. That's it. Okay.
Fred, I was going to ask you something what you mentioned ago, that you mentioned you're not in Washington right now. So when are you going to run?
Yeah, I did.
Again.
I did mention that, didn't I?
You did mention it.
I have
Well,
something.
let me survive my midterm exam. For the last week, when I've been walking on campus, at nighttime, I've been trying to stay in the shadows of the buildings. So I make sure that it's all clear. Let me get to that first. Next question. Yes, ma'am.
I think that we all have to think of the generation that brought us about.
Yeah.
And what was their psyche? All of the people, the soldiers, their spouses, the government, what was their psyche at that time?
You know what, that question dovetails very nicely with the question here about, the denier of the Holocaust. Because let's think about that. So to let us understand, this is not to say that we should be responding without urgency. We need to respond with urgency, a lot of urgency. But to show this is not the first time this happened, when Dwight Eisenhower, right, the one that was in charge of the planning for the D-Day landing, June 644, Dwight Eisenhower went to Ordre, which was a subcamp of Buchenwald, right? Just slightly worse, if you can say such a thing, than Auschwitz, or maybe just not broadcast as much or advertised as much. And Dwight Eisenhower, when he went to Ordre, he contacted George Marshall back in Washington and said, you got to send congressmen, photographers, reporters here now. He said, send it right now. George Patton, old blood and guts, pro-handle revolvers, I like to fight. Even Patton had written, Eisenhower said, I will not go back in one of those places because I'll be sick to my stomach. This is Patton, the guy that's, lived his full life in the military. So death is not new to him. But Eisenhower said to Marshall in those letters, he said, I want people to come out here and chronicle this, take pictures of it, and put it in the record because I fear a day may come when they'll deny it. So at a minimum, if we have the evidence here to prepare for the inevitable liars who will come and say it didn't happen. So will the liars come? Of course they will. That's what people do. There's always a branch of humanity that will lie about that kind of stuff. So therefore, Eisenhower, whatever one might think about him, was preparing for the inevitable denial. It is abhorrent. It is disgusting. It is insulting that the Holocaust is denied by anyone for any reason. I have been to Dachau. I had a student just last week tell me that she'd been to Sachsenhausen last summer. She didn't go there for a pleasure tour as part of she said, I wanted to confront the history. And I said, that's why I went to Dachau. Sometimes the only way to understand a thing is to go confront it. And a lot of history is great, but most of human history is full of blood and misery. But you cannot understand the reason why you're not going to do something from back then, that you go stand on the battlefield of Gettysburg and feel the tragedy of what happened. That way you'll understand what really happened to save democracy, what Abraham Lincoln said, to test whether any nation so conceived can long endure. Now we're in the Great Civil War, testing whether this nation or any nation so conceived can long endure. In other words, November 1963, we're winning right now, but I'm not sure this is going to work. You can't get that unless you're standing there at the Devil's Den at Gettysburg. So Eisenhower prepared for it. We too much prepared for it. And in the meantime, hold the line and fight. People, listen, when I ran, speaking of running, when I ran, people said to me, oh, Fred, you're running as a Democrat in a Republican Central. Yeah, I didn't notice that. But then, I got these questions like, well, why are you doing this? You know you're not going to win. I said, well, no, you know that. I don't know that. Okay, well, why am I doing it? One, I'm an American citizen. Who's my duty? My duty. Right? I tell people, listen, you can sit on the sideline and throw rocks. You can get involved. Democracy is not a self-maintaining institution. It's not on autopilot. In fact, that's part of the problem. That I've been on many people think it's on autopilot. And for God's sake, if you haven't voted, don't talk to me. Just don't. I mean, for your safety, don't talk to me. We went down. I'll tell you all this final thing. There was a in 2010 when they were running, there was a forum down in Zeeland, right? People told me, oh, Zeeland is Republican Central. Okay, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So there are nine Republicans running for the primary that year. So we went down there, and my dad said, oh, we can't go down there. I said, why not? Well, the Republicans down there. I said, yes, I know. Oh, well, we're going to go down there. They're not going to hear you have to say, well, let's just see. Well, we think they're too dangerous. I said, is that what the fight is? They said, yeah. I said, how many people do you know have won a battle by not showing up on the battlefield? Right, at a minimum, you got to go there where the fight is, right? That's the first step to get there and fight. So we went down there that evening. And because I kind of had a feeling that I wanted to cover all the bases to include foreign policy and national defense, every last one of those guys, none of whom had been in the military, talk about, well, the military should do this, blah, 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 and foreign policy over here. We should intervene over here. Not one had ever worn a uniform. So there I was, little old me, down at the far end of the table, waiting my turn. I was last. And then when my turn came, I reached below the table and put out my Marine Corps officer sword. I said, this is a Marine Corps officer sword. You can't buy these. You can't trade for these. You can't barter these. You have to earn this. And so let me put a fine point on it. None of these people have one of these. So I'm the only person up here that's earned the right to be called a Marine and lead Marines. They've worn a uniform. I have. They don't know the cost, the potential cost of what it means to send other people's children to war. I do. We had a conversation. We got quiet, much like you all are right now. And when I got through that evening, I had several people come up to me. So, I never voted for a Democrat before, but you gave me some things to think about. As it turns out, those three people, those three people were part of the 7 votes I got in the general election. I'll see you guys later.
Fred, could you put in a quick plug for the Sunday afternoon session, The Soul of Politics?
The Soul of Politics, is that we're here? Oh, right. Yes. I'm going to be at where am I going to be again? Port 393, The Soul of Politics, for a panel discussion. I remember that part.
3 p.m.
UCC?
No, it's Port 930. In our bulletin, it says 393 near 16th and.
Port 393 near 16th and?
At 3 p.m.
At 3 p.m. There's the plug. Thanks for letting me know.
It's in our church.
Right.
And if we don't see you again for a while, have a wonderful time in Vietnam.
Thanks, guys.